to this Société, Culture, Institution lecture, which will be dedicated to the topic of revolution, as per usual, and which will focus in particular on questions that have to do with geography and demography. People, the movement of people, the number of people, and this is a shorter online version of the regular lecture, which I'm hoping will be a bit more easy to digest for you as you watch it from home. This video is sponsored by Jean-Paul. This is Jean-Paul. And this video is sponsored as well by the Université Lyon 2 COP, very specifically. So let's get started rather than have a super long video that's going to bore you to death. But before we begin, a reminder that there is a revision quiz that I will put on Moodle that will allow you to recap the work done last week on the question of popular revolts and popular movements and social classes. But let's just focus on today's tasks. We have, on the one hand, the question of borders, frontiers. We'll focus on expanding borders with regards to the British Empire. But we'll also discuss the notion of the frontier, which is fundamental in US history, which will lead us to talk about Native Americans. Then we'll focus on how borders are defined politically speaking in terms of treaties or agreements, which will basically be a discussion of the union between England and other countries in the British Isles, and eventually we'll talk about shifting borders, population movements, demographic losses, with regards in particular to the Irish famine in the UK. The Great Migration will be tackled in the slides, but not in the video, once again, in the hopes of not losing you at some point throughout the video. Okay, so what it means for us today is that we'll discuss both the 17th, 18th, 19th, but also the beginning of the 20th century, even though I have decided to lighten the video by removing the last point on Great Migration. So this is something that you have to work on your own. First off, territorial expansion, the role of violence, and rebellion in territorial expansion. And we begin with, very contemporary questions, which is reactions to the Queen's death in the world, throughout the world. How did people react to the death of the Queen? Perhaps your answer at this point is that they were extremely sad. They queued up for a long time to pay their respects to the Queen. I want to show you a video, or rather a short passage from a video that I'm hoping you'll enjoy. You can watch the full video on Moodle. It will highlight some of the perhaps less known reactions to the Queen's death. So let's begin with this video.
Moving on. Our main story tonight concerns the British monarchy, the best thing to happen to white actors since literally everything else. The monarchy has given the world royal weddings, the unveiling of new royal babies, and of course, moments like this.
He may have grown up in a palace, but today Prince Charles was doing his best to get in touch with the mood on the streets.
Oh, dig that crazy rhythm.
Oh, no. There is perhaps nothing more pathetic than the world's most famous adult son saying, dig that crazy rhythm, with what I can only describe as big narc energy. The monarchy is clearly in transition right now following the death of the Queen, an event that prompted 10 days of public mourning with a massive line of people queuing for hours to pay their respects. But while some were devastated, others had more complicated feelings.
The Queen, it's like, I care, but I don't. That's me being real.
So tell me about the care part and then tell me about the don't care part.
I care because it's our queen.
It's our queen and it's a person who died, like, sad, like...
Okay, and then the don't care part?
She ain't done nothing for us.
So you see that reactions were not necessarily always reactions of sadness, or at least they were not necessarily unmixed sadness. Was she universally beloved? That's the next question.
But their ambivalence speaks to the fact that, to a degree that Americans may not realise, the monarchy isn't a universally beloved institution, and they were being very nice about it there. Others have been much less kind. In the aftermath of the Queen's death, many sporting events held a minute's silence, but some crowds, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, went a different way, with this song proving particularly popular. Yeah, Lizzie's in a box, which I know sounds insensitive, but I would argue that of all the places they could have chanted that she was in, box is actually pretty generous. And look, you can make the case that that is in bad taste. You can also make the case that it's very funny. Two things can be true here.
So the point of these videos is to highlight the fact that the reactions to the Queen's death were not reactions of universal sadness. And this is in part related to the connection that is made between the monarchy, between the British monarchy, and between the British Empire, which no longer exists, but has committed certain atrocities, violent atrocities, as the public was reminded of in this headline from The Guardian. There were tweets that were also shared condemning the monarchy's role in the violence that was committed during the period of the British Empire's rule. And I'll highlight one tweet in particular this time that doesn't criticize the monarchy, but that led people to criticize the country. It's a reference to the fact that when Britain abolished slavery in its empire, those who owned slaves were compensated by the British state, something referred to as basically the Slavery Abolition Act and the compensation that was given to former slave owners. Now, what this tweet tells us, this is an official tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury. What it tells us is that basically it's only in 2015 that the debt to those former slave owners was paid, which basically means that everyone paying taxes in the UK up until 2015 was partly participating in the paying back of the money that was borrowed in order to compensate former slave owners, which is described as a surprising Friday fact, which is mostly a horrifying Friday fact. So basically, imperial questions are still very much relevant, even though the British Empire, of course, no longer exists. When we talk about empire, we need to focus on a long period of time, from the 16th century all the way to the 20th century. In particular, what we'll focus on today is the imperial century, the 19th century. However, we'll recap very briefly and in a very simple way the steps that led there. By 1914, the empire covered 1/5 of the whole planet, and it encompassed about 1/4 of the world's population, which has led it to be described as a place where the sun never sets. Indeed, a huge, huge empire. It starts with explorations, and of course, if we think about explorations, you might say to yourself, oh well, when the Spanish and the Portuguese also involved in conquests, and they were. Of course, it's the Portuguese and not the Portuguese, so somebody needs to, make changes to the typos that they've done in their PowerPoints. As Jean-Paul would say, nobody's perfect. Elizabethan England at first was a little bit preoccupied with stuff, like for instance, religious wars and stabilizing the country and avoiding civil wars. But she did encourage expeditions. In particular, she encouraged the voyages of Francis Drake, who was a privateer, which, for those of you who are interested in pirates, raises lots of questions. There were sea raiders in the 16th century known as sea dogs, who basically would plunder the treasures, in particular of the Spanish. So, interestingly enough, when Disney tells us a good pirate never takes another person's property, what Disney's describing is a very shit pirate. But, setting things aside, from 1606 onwards, there were colonies that were created in the Americas, of course, as I'm sure you're aware of, in Northern America. There were also colonies in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, as they were called, like Barbados, Jamaica. Each of them had its own political specificity. They were run by a group or run by a person who would be described as a governor. And there was not much interference from London. The motivations for the creation of these colonies were, of course, commercial motivations and economic motivations. Indeed, there were pillages, there were plunders of the riches of those particular places. So some of the motivations, and not motivations, and justifications that were used to basically find ways of excusing or explaining the imperial expansion of Britain. There were people, of course, as you know, who left the old world, as it was sometimes called, to escape religious persecutions, for instance, Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania. They were also hoping for new economic opportunities in a place that supposedly had a lot of vacant lands, even though this is something that is actually not exactly true, as you know, because the land was occupied, it wasn't vacant. This was also sustained by European tastes for tropical produce like tobacco, rice, sugar, tea, coffee, cotton. And we could add a political motivation as well, because there was a desire to assert dominance over rival countries like the Portuguese, or also, and I'm sure you're thinking of this, the French. First Holland, Spain, Portugal, and then France. So let's take a look at a realistic recreation of the French and English rivalry.
Oh! Oh my god! That French guy! Ah! Oh my god, that frog! Make her on! Oh, that frog! Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh no! It is that French guy again! Oh god, that French dude! Oh my god, the frog! Ah, I'm gonna get that frog! Oh my god! De la batterie! Ah! Oh, you frog! Espace de grenouille! Oh, le trash! Le trash! Je suis piqué!
So clearly, as you can tell from these videos, the situation was rather tense between the French and the English. So perhaps a little bit of a recap would be useful at this point. The main reasons why people wanted to leave their original country and settle somewhere else, for instance in the Americas, had to do with trade, economic opportunities, international politics, as you've just been witness to, religious reasons, persecutions, personal ambition, but also patriotic ambition to expand the sphere of influence of their country. A sense of adventure, the desire for fresh starts, the hope to acquire new lands, and in certain cases, getting rid of unwanted people. That's a reference to those who were transported against their will, for instance, to colonies at first in the Americas, until the Americas said to England that they didn't want England anymore, and then later on people who were transported to Australia. This leads us to a second phase in the history of the empire after the loss of the American colonies in the late 18th century and early 19th century. We witness a strong abolitionist movement with personalities like Thomas Clarkson and very popular imagery that was used to promote the abolition of slavery. For instance, that particular medallion, that engraving that you can see on screen, or a representation of a slave trading ship that showed the terrible conditions in which people would travel, would be transported, and that raised awareness, which eventually led to the Slave Trade Act and the Slavery Abolition Act, a little under 30 years later. So in that second phase, we have an abolitionist movement. We have transportation to Australia until the 1840s, 1853, 1868, depending on the penal colony, which raises questions for those of you who are interested in Aboriginal peoples and Strait Islander peoples, sometimes called First Peoples as well, First Nations, who were often considered as too uncivilized to even deserve treaties, and who were the object of much violence, who were also likely to catch diseases that they had not become immune to, because those were not diseases that existed there. Those were diseases that were brought by Europeans. So feel free to really dig deeper into those questions if you're curious about that. And then we have a third phase in the history of the British Empire, which basically leads us to highlight the existence of different types of colonies in the 1850s, with colonies of settlement like Australia that we've just mentioned, or Canada and New Zealand, or places in South Africa, at least until the Boer Wars. You also had the Caribbean islands that were known as the West Indies, and strategic territories as well. Now, more specifically on the colonies of settlements, from the 1840s onwards, there was gradually the idea of responsible governments that was promoted, with, however, economic dependence on the mother country. What does it all mean? Basically, the idea was to wait for colonies to be more mature, which of course is very paternalistic, and gradually to grant them a form of autonomy. Between 1867 and 1910, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa broke away to different various degrees, acquiring self-government, dominion status in Canada or Australia, that is to say more autonomy and self-government. If you want to go further, because these are questions that are of interest to you, I invite you to look up the question of residential schools in Canada, or the so-called pacification by force of Aboriginal people in Australia. However, there was a rebellion that took place in India that led to a stronger, more intense form of government in India, which was not a colony of settlements. India was a densely populated place with long established civilizations. It had a long history of having contact with Europeans. In 1600s, So we go all the way back to the very end of the Elizabethan period. The East India Company had been created. What the hell is the East India Company? It's basically a private company that was owned by wealthy people, wealthy British people, and it was granted a monopoly of trade between Britain and Asia, meaning that they were the only ones who were allowed to trade. However, there was a mutiny in 1857 which led the British government to take over control from the East India Company. This was a rebellion that occurred in 1857 and that was prompted by an undermining of cultural and political traditions in India, with something that had to do with rifles. If you're curious, you can look up the link that I shared with you on Moodle. The reprisals of the British Army far outweighed the original excesses, if we could call them that, or the original actions that had been led by Indian rebels. There was a merciless reaction, and imperial authority was restored with the crown taking over the East India Company and the creation of the British Raj. Now we get to the end of the 19th century, which leads us to the question of the scramble for Africa, which is not something that was only taking place in the British Empire. It's basically European powers trying to grab as much land as they could through force and violence in Africa, with, in the 1870s, 10% of the continent under European rule, and in 1914, 90% of the continent under European rule. Amongst the justifications that were put forward to justify the seizing, the grabbing, the forced taking of that lands, was the idea that the British were bringing civilization. We could quote Lord Salisbury, a Conservative MP, who argued that the British Empire was a great civilizing, Christianizing force. It was the promotion of the belief that Britain had a responsibility to free Africans from what they saw as their primitive past. Don't forget that this is not a reflection of reality in any shape or form, but rather justifications that were used to take advantage of places, to take advantage of their riches, their raw materials, to take advantage of their lands and their populations. Often the expression a white man's burden is used to refer to this idea of a civilizing mission, even though the poem that was written by Kipling, called The White Man's Burden, was not about Britain. But there was a strong belief that was held that the so-called English race had superior qualities, that they would bring the blessings of civilization, and that empire in this regard was something that was done out of duty. Again, this is not, of course, anything other than a means of justifying the violence that was committed in order to grab that land. Now, speaking of the question of expansion, now a short couple of words about the frontier in the US. We've tackled a few moments ago the question of the colonies, then the loss of the American colonies. So now we refocus on the other side of the Atlantic. And we discussed the notion of the frontier with a capital F. It's that idea of the advancing border that marked lands that had been settled by European settlers. There was a westward movement of those settlers from their original settlements on the Atlantic coast towards the far west, which took decades and decades and decades and decades. If this is something that you're interested in, I invite you to take a look at this particular painting called American Progress, which was done in the 19th century, and raises questions about westward expansion, the way in which it was envisaged as the manifest destiny of the US. And this is also something that we'll discuss in year 2. So violence is something that is very much inherent to the American experiments with the displacements of Native Americans. Territorial expansion was done at the expense of the native population. There was an Indian Removal Act that was passed in 1830 and led to a tragic event in the history of the US, the forced relocation of some Native Americans to the West, an event that has been referred to as the Trail of Tears, which is also something that we'll discuss in more details next year. Of course, there was resistance. For instance, we could mention the Apache chief Geronimo, but there are lots of other examples that you can also dig, that you can also look up. This leads us to the question of the definition of borders. We've talked about expanding the lands within, either one continent or throughout the planet in the name of various justifications. But how are borders defined? We'll talk specifically about Scotland and Ireland, even though there is also a word on Wales in the full set of slides that I'll be sharing with you. The Act of Union between England and Scotland created one state, Great Britain, in 1707. Of course, you remember that ever since the reign of James I of England, there had been a union of crowns, but the two states had remained separate. Now we can wonder if this particular Act of Union was a treaty of union between equals who would be on the same level, or if this is something that was imposed on Scotland from the top. The Scottish Parliament was abolished. There's no question there. Scottish members of Parliament would now sit in the English Parliament in Westminster, in London. But that being said, Scotland kept its own legal system, it kept its own church called the Scottish Kirk. And what it gained as well was the ability to trade freely with England and to trade freely with its colonies. Scottish poet Robert Burns says that Scotland was bought and sold for English gold, which would suggest perhaps that this is something that was not a treaty between equals, but this remains a very open question and something that is debated. Now, what about islands? How far do we go back? We could go back a lot further, but we'll go back to the 16th century, a moment when English kings were named kings of England or later Britain with the Act of Union that we've just mentioned. During the reign of James I, there was an organised colonisation of lands called the Ulster Plantation, Ulster being a region of Ireland, that is in the north of Ireland. James I believed it would tame the rude and barbarous Irish people. So you can see that already there was a certain feeling of superiority on the part of English people. At the end of the 17th century, most of the lands belonged to British landlords rather than Irish people themselves. The Irish peasants would rent small pieces of land on mainly English-owned estates, lands. There were rebellions throughout the period of history between the Ulster Plantation and the Act of Union, which also probably played a part in the desire that England had to keep Ireland under control, which led to the Act of Union of 1800s, Anglicanism at that point became the official religion, and you probably remember that Irish people traditionally tended to be not Protestants but Catholics. Catholics were, however, banned from political office and civil service until Catholic emancipation about 30 years later. The Dublin Parliament was also abolished, and there was the official creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Here you can see, if you're looking at the slides, a representation of two symbols of both countries: John Bull symbolizing Britain, England, and Hibernia symbolizing Ireland. So the Second Act of Union in 1800 led to the creation of the United Kingdom with, in it, England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. Now, we'll keep discussing the question of Ireland, but we'll focus in particular on questions that have to do with population and demography. How has life expectancy changed over time? It may seem like a silly question, but it will help us understand the extent of the tragedy that affected Ireland in the 19th century. In 1841, the average newborn girl was not expected to see her 43rd birthday. In other words, she would not be expected to live beyond 43. In the 1840s, around 15 to 25% of babies would die before their first birthday, so life expectancy would be higher once you'd gone past that first year. In 1900s, life expectancy would be about 47 for a man and 50 for a woman. So there was a general improvement, especially over the Victorian era, with Britain going through its demographic transition. Between 1851 and 1911, a period of 60 years of history, the population of England and Wales more than doubled. But what about the population in Ireland? There was rapid growth in Ireland before the 19th century, with high fertility rates, early marriage, earlier than England actually, so rapid growth. Yet Ireland's population went from 8.2 million in 1841 to 3.2 million in 1901. What happened that led to a population loss of more than half what it was in 1841? This leads us to the question of the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger. The Great Famine started in 1845. And it started as a natural catastrophe with the failure of the potato crop, the potato cultivation, because of the potato blight, a fungus that affected potatoes and turned them into something really gooey, something really black and disgusting and unedible. The Irish peasantry relied on potatoes for about 60% of their food needs, which meant that it was a very, very hard blow. It had consequences on their health, on the lands, on demography, on language, and even on nationalism. Partly because of the British government's failure to react quickly enough. By 1851, 6 years after the beginning of the potato famine, the Irish famine, about 1 million people had died from either starvation or diseases. Indeed, smallpox, fever, tuberculosis, bronchitis, influenza, or the flu as we call it today, pneumonia and other diseases hit a population that was weakened a lot by hunger. Of course, there were regional differences, meaning that certain regions were affected more than others. Skibbereen was one of the most affected places, with a mass grave containing from anywhere between 8,000 to 10,000 bodies. This led to massive emigration of Irish people. So there was population loss due to starvation, diseases, but also due to emigration. People who lived but decided to live somewhere else. At first, they would leave on ships that were poorly built, and that's were places where your hopes of surviving were so low that they became known as coffin ships. The journey to go to the North American colonies, that is to say to Canada, especially in the first years of the famine, was a very long journey. And in the spring of 1847, there were lots and lots of ships that arrived on the coast of Canada with fevered Irish people, quickly overwhelming the places that were set up to inspect them and quarantine those who appeared to be sick. So in June of that year, there was a line of 40 ships containing 14,000 Irish immigrants, a line that extended 2 miles down the River St. Lawrence from where they would be arriving. After the 1847 tragedies of leaving towards Canada, more and more Irish people turned to the US. That was a place that was seen as a magnet, partly because it was just not British, and English people had become associated with the oppression of Irish people and disregard for Irish people. Therefore, it was a more attractive place because it had literally said to Britain, fuck off, and had created its own country. It was a symbol of freedom, where the American dream would allow Irish people to start afresh, to start from scratch. Yet, once they got there, they faced discrimination and prejudice on the parts of Americans. So it was far from being an ideal land of welcoming people only. The reaction in Westminster, or rather the lack of quick reaction, the failure of the British to react quickly, had consequences, politically speaking. Because little was done by the British government, because not much was done in order to help the Irish, it was felt that the Irish had been betrayed. Westminster at first believed that the Irish had had famines before, so they would know what to do. Some people in England believed that if they helped the Irish, it would not teach them a proper lesson. So there was also that idea that this was a tragedy, yes, but at the same time would teach them to eat beef rather than potatoes. Plus, free trade was also something that was in economic policy that prevailed, and for some it was literally a lesson from God for being Catholic, for being lazy, and all of the prejudice that would affect the Irish. It wasn't a majority, but there were some who did believe that this was the case. Because this is a conversation about Ireland that sounds dreary and is quite gloomy. I thought I would share with you some of the beautiful pictures of things that Ireland brings us, not necessarily to promote tourism in Ireland, although if you feel like you want to go to Ireland, go for it. There were wonderful and beautiful things to see in Ireland. And also, this is a good opportunity to recommend, on a most serious note, Derry Girls, if you haven't seen this TV series, which doesn't focus on the period that we're discussing together, but that I'm sure you will enjoy and appreciate a lot. Next week, we'll be discussing the question of gender rebellions. We'll be discussing the suffrage in particular in the UK and also in the US. Until then, take good care of yourself. Feel free to share any of the questions that you may have, and feel free to send me an email if you've got specific requests. Take care. Jean-Paul says goodbye.